Europe was kind of a mess in the 15th century. The so-called Burgundian State, a regional powerhouse that had emerged in the late medieval period, led by the ambitious Charles the Bold, soon found itself embroiled in an increasingly bloody war of revenge with the Old Swiss Confederacy, which in time led to a clash between two of the continent's strongest armies in 1477. This battle, the Battle of Nancy, all but forgotten today, ultimately redrew the borders for a number of European states, the impact of which could still be felt well into the 20th century. So yeah, if this sounds interesting to you, stay tuned, and if you just came across the channel, consider subscribing for more content about forgotten history. Our story begins in medieval France, where the king, John II, also known as John the Good, had decided to make his son, Philip, Duke of the Duchy of Burgundy in 1363. The duchy was located along the kingdom's eastern border with the Holy Roman Empire, and, in a relatively short period of time, it had grown to possess a number of territories stretching from the Western Alps to the North Sea. Some of these, like the County of Flanders, technically in part belonged to the Holy Roman Empire, though. In time, the relationship between the Duchy of Burgundy and France worsened. There were many reasons behind this, but perhaps that will be covered in a future episode. What should be noted though is the Dukes of Burgundy were, by this point, increasingly acting independently from France and sometimes even against France itself. In 1435, the vassal-master relationship between the two essentially came to an end following the signing of the Treaty of Arras, which stipulated that Burgundy no longer had to pay tribute while still nominally belonging to the Kingdom of France. Furthermore, the duchy was formally granted a number of disputed territories, but, in turn, had to recognize the French king, Charles VI, who was then embroiled in conflict with England. All things being said, the Duchy of Burgundy seemed to have a pretty bright future ahead of it. It controlled a sizable amount of territory, which, as mentioned, included centers of major economic activity like Flanders and other parts of the modern Benelux states. These areas were among the wealthiest throughout the whole of Europe, but one problem remained. The territories up north didn't have a land connection with the Burgundian territories down south, so the Dukes of Burgundy set about figuring a way to bridge this gap. They also refused an offer of vassalage by the Holy Roman Emperor, which, was kind of complicated in that some of the duchy's possessions overlapped with those of the Holy Roman Empire itself. In 1465, Charles I, also known as Charles the Bold, became Duke of Burgundy, and he very much believed the best way to deal with the duchy's territorial issues was through expansion at the expense of their neighbors. Rumors quickly spread that he wanted to become king, not merely duke, after having connected the two parts of Burgundy, and some even said he had far more ambitious plans to become the Holy Roman Emperor. Whether true or not, surrounding cities and states became ever more cautious of the new Burgundian ruler. Charles had a problem though. He didn't have a son, and so the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick III, tried making one of his sons marry the daughter of Charles the Bold in exchange for him declaring Charles King of Burgundy, but the arrangement failed in 1473. A year later, in 1474, Charles marched with his army to Cologne, which was an archbishopric and electoral state of the Holy Roman Empire. A little background here. The Holy Roman Emperor was chosen by 7 electoral states within the Holy Roman Empire itself. At the time, these were Brandenburg, the Palatinate, Cologne, Trier, Mainz, Saxony, and Bohemia. The person who received the most votes became emperor, so Charles' move on Cologne was not insignificant as it affected the whole of the HRE. But Charles didn't plan on attacking the elector, the dreadfully unpopular Archbishop of Cologne, Ruprecht. Rather, he came to the archbishop's aid following a citywide revolt and therefore likely was securing his own position within the HRE's power structure. This, however, was the beginning of what later would be called the Burgundian Wars. But let's step back for a moment. The situation was rather complicated and needs further explanation. Okay, so some years back, the Archduke of Austria, Sigismund, found himself on the losing side of a war against the Old Swiss Confederacy. When he later signed the Treaty of St. Omer, the Swiss demanded the Archduke pay 10,000 gold coins, but he was broke. So, Sigismund tried finding a supporter who'd finance his debt and found one in Charles the Bold. Sigismund pawned his possessions in the Alsace region as a fiefdom to Charles. Knowing about Sigismund's inability to handle his personal finances, Charles was sure he could integrate these territories into the Burgundian State. But there was a snag. Sigismund was not the ruler of Austria nor the Holy Roman Empire. An archduke was not the same as a de facto ruler. The actual ruler of Austria and emperor of the HRE was the previously mentioned Frederick III. And he really couldn't do anything since he was preoccupied with the Ottomans. Basically, all male princes in the Habsburg family in Austria were called archdukes, more or less. To secure Burgundian dominance over these newly acquired territories, Charles selected a more than capable knight, Peter von Hagenbach. Bach. Yeah. And while initially level-headed in executing his duties, after some time, von Hagenbach became increasingly despotic. He tried leveling excessive taxes on Swiss cities and their allies, like Basel and Zurich, while also isolating those in the Alsace region. A revolt, backed by Bern and Fribourg, soon broke out, and the rebels eventually captured von Hagenbach. He was then put on trial, declared guilty, and executed by beheading. Meanwhile, the HRE and Old Swiss Confederacy had made a new deal called the Perpetual Accord. The Old Swiss Confederacy decided to give Archduke Sigismund a loan, and with that, he would try to get Alsace back from Charles the Bold, who promptly declined the offer. Okay, so remember the Treaty of St. Omer? Yeah, that wasn't valid anymore, and in part was a reason given for von Hagenbach's capture and execution. We kinda have a what came first situation here, the chicken or the egg, although it's obviously the egg since dinosaurs were laying them long before chickens even existed, and Charles, who had decided to lay siege to the imperial city of Neuss, sent von Hagenbach's brother, Stephen, together with 6,000 mercenaries to sack the region as an act of revenge. This in turn provoked the Lower League, a coalition mostly within the HRE opposed to Burgundy's consolidation of power, and some claim this actually was the start of the Burgundian Wars. But we're still not done. So far it sounds like Burgundy was the aggressor, and it was, but it wasn't the only one. The King of France, Louis XI, had a contract with the Old Swiss Confederacy in which he paid them 20,000 gold coins yearly, and in the event of a war, 20,000 gold coins every quarter year. In particular, the city of Bern was rather aggressive, and the initial treaty between Charles and Sigismund was partially done to stem expansionism stemming from the Old Swiss Confederacy and Basel. This, however, eventually resulted in the creation of the already mentioned Lower League, which included the Free Imperial City of Basel, Strasbourg, Colmar, and Celista. In time, the Old Swiss Confederacy, Fribourg, and Lorraine joined the coalition as well. Oh, and just a quick word about governmental structures here, since it, honestly speaking, is kinda complicated. Free imperial cities were cities within the HRE that were subjects of the emperor himself, and therefore not subject to local dukes or counts. None of the mentioned free imperial cities were part of the Old Swiss Confederacy in 1474, which itself was basically an alliance of 8 cantons, semi-sovereign states inside what nowadays is Switzerland. The Old Swiss Confederacy included those you see on screen right now. But anyway, let's get back to the Burgundian Wars. The forces of the Lower League quickly deployed and entered Burgundian territory, fighting an army under the command of General Henri de Nourenbourg-Blaumont at the Battle of Héricourt in November 1474, which proved a heavy defeat for Burgundy, having lost about 3,000 men. The Duchy of Savoy, however, soon entered the conflict on the side of the Burgundian State. While all this was happening, Charles was still in the Alsace region. But with the siege of Neuss at a stalemate, he opted to withdraw in 1475. He didn't return directly to Burgundy, but rather decided to attack the Duchy of Lorraine. After this, he marched off to Bern, the city he believed was the driving force behind the Lower League. En route, he besieged the city of Grandson, whose garrison surrendered, allowing Charles to take the city without much trouble. He then ordered the entire garrison of 412 people to be paraded by his tent before having them executed in a move almost certainly designed to instill fear among the Swiss population. According to contemporary sources, the mass execution lasted hours, with men either being hanged from trees and or drowned in a nearby lake. As later described by one eyewitness, there were found, sadly, the honorable men still freshly hanging on the trees in front of the castle whom the tyrant had hanged. It was a wretched, pitiable sight. There were hung 10 or 20 men on one bough. The trees were bent down and were completely full. Here hanged a father and a son next to each other. There were 2 brothers or other friends. And there came the honorable men who knew them, who were their friends, cousins, and brothers, who found them miserably hanging. But word soon came that an army of the lower league was rapidly approaching Charles's position. The Burgundian army of about 20,000 men was one of the best equipped of the time. They had hundreds of cannons in a time when gunpowder weaponry was still relatively new in Europe, including men armed with arquebuses, a form of long gun. Add to that some heavy cavalry, crossbows, and you unquestionably had one of the most modern armies of the 1470s. They were opposed by a slightly larger force made up mostly of infantry without a sizable cavalry. But surprisingly, the Burgundian army lost in the Battle of Grandson on March 2, 1476. Because the Swiss and their allies didn't possess a significant cavalry, casualties on the Burgundian side likely didn't exceed 1,000 men. Nonetheless, the defeat was humiliating for Charles. His army had cavalry, the most modern equipment and weaponry, while his opponent lacked nearly all of this, and yet, his opponent had prevailed, and now 400 of his cannons fell into the hands of the lower league. A few months later, Charles began a new offensive. His ally Savoy had surrendered following his defeat at Grandson, but Charles believed he could take Bern, and in June 1476, he arrived outside the city of Morat. The city had a rather large, well-equipped garrison, which gave the Old Swiss Confederacy time to react. They soon deployed a force of their own and confronted the Burgundians again, and Charles lost again. In part owing to difficulty, hilly terrain, and poor decision-making, the Burgundians lost 10,000 men in their worst defeat yet. But Charles couldn't back down now, so he mustered a force in autumn of 1476 and planned to capture the Duchy of Lorraine's capital, the city of Nancy. Charles laid siege to Nancy that October, making his first strategic mistake as his army had to endure a particularly harsh winter outside the city walls. René II, Duke of Lorraine, upon hearing of the siege, came to relieve the city with a force of about 19,000 men. Charles had somewhere around 15,000 men at his disposal, but he would not be facing off with René, but rather 2 skilled generals named William Hertler and Oswald von Thurstein, who led the Lorraine forces into battle as the Army Council thought René to be too inexperienced. On January 5, 1477, the 2 armies met. Initially, things looked good for the defending Burgundian army since they held the high ground on a nearby hill. Heavy snowfall made fighting difficult though, and likely because of this, Charles didn't notice a large group of lower league soldiers taking position on a hill off his right flank. To their left was a river, behind them the city of Nancy, and in front of them the rest of the enemy army. In short, Charles and the Burgundian forces were now boxed in. A Swiss horn then sounded thrice, and somewhere around 8,000 Swiss and Lorraine troops under the command of General Wilhelm Hertler himself emerged from the wooded slopes off the Burgundian rear in a surprise attack. The Burgundian heavy cavalry was able to withstand the initial attack, but their infantry didn't fare so well. Moreover, Charles's artillery could not aim high enough to be effective, and was therefore essentially useless in the ensuing battle. The left side of the Burgundian flank was thrown back and soon routed. Charles, seeing the disaster unfolding around him, transferred troops from his left to right flank, but the Swiss and Lorraine soldiers had momentum, and the Burgundian army started to waver. Charles and his commanders tried to rally, but there was little hope they would recover from this blow. They simply were overwhelmed, and recognizing this, Charles reportedly said, "I struggle against a spider who is everywhere at once." A short while later, Charles received a halberd strike directly to his head. Well, probably. There are some contradicting stories about how the once mighty Duke of Burgundy met his end. But one thing was clear, the Battle of Nancy was over, and it was a crushing defeat. The Burgundian army, now in a complete rout, tried making its way back to Metz, some 31 miles or 50 kilometers away from the battlefield. However, the Swiss and Lorrainers continued to pursue the fleeing soldiers, leaving dead bodies scattered across the frozen countryside. Reportedly, those few Burgundians who made it to Metz were so fearful of being captured, they threw themselves into the city's icy moat, desperately hoping to find a way inside. In part, due to this battle, the Swiss gained a reputation as more than capable fighters, and their Pike Square tactical formation was soon copied by other armies. This reputation also led to a famous part of the Swiss military, which remains in service to this day, the Swiss Guard, established by Pope Julius II in 1506. But let's get back to Charles for a moment. The reason why that story with the halberd strike is questionable is because his dead body was not found at the battle site initially. Rather, it was 3 days later that his mutilated corpse was found and identified by one of his servants based on physical traits such as scars from previous battles. Charles's body was mutilated and therefore not easy to identify. He had received 2 injuries, probably from pikes to his abdomen, and a final blow that split his skull. Charles's body had also been stripped almost completely naked, his clothes and items likely being taken as spoils of war. Moreover, wolves had eaten parts of his body, the remainder of which had been exposed to freezing winter temperatures. Alongside Charles, his most loyal guards and military advisors' bodies were found near his own. For Burgundy, things looked quite bad after the Battle of Nancy. Since Charles had died without a legitimate male heir, his 19-year-old daughter, Mary, sometimes also called Mary the Rich, became the Duchess of Burgundy. She ultimately married Archduke Maximilian of Austria, though a relative of the French king, Louis XI, had tried to woo her as well. The exact status of her territory was unclear though, and wars soon occurred which saw Burgundy further divided. This, however, laid the foundation for the rise of the Habsburg in Europe, as they not only gained a number of prosperous territories, but what's more, Mary and Maximilian's son, Philip I, would later become King of Castile, which then exercised control over much of the Iberian Peninsula. Later, a certain Charles V inherited all of these possessions and became one of the most powerful rulers of his time. We've actually met him already in an episode about the ghost colony of Klein Venedig, so, if you're interested, check that out. Nowadays, the battlefield of Nancy is within the modern prefecture of Nancy. Here you can find a small church, and there's a little park with a memorial called the Cross of Burgundy, a testament to not only a ghost country, but a largely forgotten chapter of European history.